My 26F boyfriend, 27M, always gets mad at me when I'm upset. This issue had taken root so deeply that it felt like a living thing, a constant presence in my life, whispering doubts, eroding my sense of peace, wearing me down like waves against a jagged shoreline. 9 years. 9 long years, during which I had learned, over and over again, that my feelings, my natural, human reactions to frustration, sadness, and disappointment were not only unacknowledged but ridiculed, dismissed, turned into weapons against me. Any time I found myself caught in the grasp of a negative mood, he would amplify it, twist it into something grotesque and unbearable, as though my pain were an inconvenience to him, an intrusion into his carefully cultivated emotional landscape. It wasn't enough that I was struggling, he had to make sure I knew just how much my emotions ruined things for him. To him, I wasn't simply upset. No, I was moping, a word he wielded like a gavel, a judgment passed down with an air of casual cruelty. If I fell silent in distress, it wasn't an act of self-preservation or a means of collecting my thoughts, it was an attack on him. My sadness, my frustration, my quiet contemplation were not things he sought to understand or soothe but rather obstacles in his path, roadblocks to his own sense of contentment. And so, instead of offering comfort or kindness, he met my pain with derision, with mockery, with laughter that cut deeper than I could have ever anticipated. He claimed that my silence made him miserable, as though my only purpose in the relationship was to serve as a beacon of light, an ever-present source of joy, never faltering, never needing anything in return. I had learned to internalize this pattern, to anticipate it, but that never dulled the sting. It only made it more exhausting. And the worst part was that he truly seemed to believe that he was in the right, that my quiet processing of emotions was an affront to him, something I should suppress for the sake of his comfort. He saw no issue in diminishing me, in making me feel small, in brushing aside my struggles as though they were trivial inconveniences rather than deeply felt experiences. And so it continued, day after day, year after year, until moments that should have been simple, frustrating but manageable, became unbearable trials, small fires that he stoked until they became wild, raging infernos. The 4th of July weekend had been uneventful. We had come back from our trip on Sunday, and I was settling back into the routine of my life when, on Monday morning, I walked outside to find my car missing. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I scanned the empty space where it should have been. At first, I thought I was mistaken, maybe I had parked in a different spot, maybe I had overlooked something obvious. But as I pieced it together, the sickening realization hit me. My car had been towed. Wrongfully. I had done nothing wrong, had parked where I always did, had followed the rules, and yet here I was, staring at an absence where my car should have been, knowing that the resolution would not be simple, that it would cost me time, money, and sanity. The frustration was immediate and overwhelming. I couldn't afford to be paying hundreds of dollars for something that wasn't my fault, and the injustice of it burned in my chest like acid. But instead of exploding in anger or lashing out, I did what I always did, I swallowed it, kept it contained, let my silence be my shield. I climbed into his car when he offered to drive me to Lower Wacker to retrieve it, my thoughts racing, my hands tight in my lap, my jaw set in quiet resignation. I was upset, but I wasn't causing a scene. I wasn't raising my voice or placing blame. I was simply dealing with the weight of an unfair situation the only way I knew how, by withdrawing into myself, by giving my emotions space to settle so I could move forward. And yet, to him, my reaction was unacceptable. He glanced over at me, taking in my silence, the way I stared out the window, lost in thought, and instead of offering the barest scrap of sympathy, he laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, filled with something bitter, and then came the words I had come to expect. The mocking tone, the same tired accusation. Oh, here we go, you're moping again. God, you're miserable to be around. It was as if he had reached inside me and twisted something vital. The moment had already been bad, frustrating, disheartening, but now, it was something worse. His words took my quiet suffering and made it unbearable, turned my attempt at self-soothing into another reason to feel ashamed, another reason to feel wrong. He wasn't angry on my behalf, wasn't offering reassurance or support. He was ridiculing me, making me feel ridiculous for being upset, as if my reaction was the real problem rather than the fact that my car had been towed unjustly. And in that instant, I wasn't just upset about the car anymore. I was upset about him, about us, about the way he made every moment harder instead of easier, about the way he seemed to relish tearing me down when I was already struggling. I wanted to scream, to tell him that he was making everything worse, that his laughter and his dismissiveness were like knives carving into my already raw emotions. But I knew that wouldn't help. It never did. If I raised my voice, if I let my frustration spill out, it would only give him more ammunition, another reason to call me irrational, to act like I was the problem. And so I did what I had learned to do. I kept quiet, even as my anger simmered beneath the surface, even as I felt myself withdrawing further and further from him. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of paperwork, fees, and frustration, but what should have been a bad start to the day turned into something that lingered, poisoning the air between us for days, weeks even. He left for a work trip later that week, and instead of missing him, instead of feeling his absence like a weight in my chest, I felt relieved. Because when he wasn't there, at least I didn't have to constantly defend my right to feel, to process, to simply exist in the full spectrum of human emotion without being mocked for it. And yet, I knew it wasn't over. It never was. Because this wasn't about one morning, one fight, one incident. This was a pattern, a cycle that had been playing out for nearly a decade. And no matter how many times I tried to explain it to him, no matter how many times I asked for kindness instead of cruelty, understanding instead of dismissal, the result was always the same. A fight. A dismissal. A promise that things would stay the same. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure he realized just how much it hurt me. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. The morning started like any other routine, predictable. I had gone to bed feeling accomplished after a long day, knowing I had stocked the fridge with groceries, planning meals in my head, ensuring that the week ahead would be organized and stress-free in at least one small way. But when I opened the fridge the next morning, the sight before me sent a sinking feeling straight to the pit of my stomach. The door had been left slightly ajar, and the cool air that should have preserved everything inside had slipped away, leaving behind a disaster. Meat that should have been firm and cold now sat in a tepid pool of its own juices, dairy softened and slumped, vegetables no longer crisp but wilted, defeated. Everything, every carefully chosen item, every dollar spent, every mental calculation that had gone into my shopping trip was wasted. I stood there, frozen, the weight of it pressing on my chest. I hated waste. It wasn't just about the money, though that certainly stung. It was the principle of it, the thought that I had taken the time to plan, to prepare, to do something responsible and necessary, only for it to be undone by something as simple as a door left open. And the worst part? I hadn't done it. I knew I hadn't. I was meticulous, careful. If I had been the one to make the mistake, I would have been mad at myself, sure, but it wouldn't have festered like this. I let out a sigh. Not even an exaggerated one, just a small release of breath, a quiet exhale of disappointment. That was all it took. From the other room, he heard it. And, as if on cue, he responded not with concern, not with an offer to replace what had been lost, not with an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, he had been the one to leave the door open. No, instead, he let out a dramatically exaggerated sigh of his own, mocking mine, turning my frustration into a joke, as if to say, here she goes again, making a big deal out of nothing. It was a small thing. Just a sound, really. But it wasn't about the sound. It was about the message behind it. It was the way it dismissed me, the way it turned my perfectly reasonable frustration into something petty, something laughable. And suddenly, I felt small again, ridiculous for feeling anything at all. But I didn't push it. Not this time. I had learned to pick my battles, and I knew that if I let my irritation show, if I pointed out what he had done, it would somehow turn into my fault. So I swallowed it. I closed the fridge, threw out the ruined food, and forced myself to move on. But things like that don't really disappear, do they? They settle, layer upon layer, each moment of dismissal adding to the last until the weight of it is too much to bear. And then, there was that night. The one where, yet again, a seemingly small moment unraveled into something bigger, heavier, harder to ignore. We were watching The Bachelor, something we often did together, laughing at the absurdity of it, making light-hearted comments about the contestants, playing the part of detached observers. It was harmless fun, or at least it was supposed to be. Until he said it. "You're hotter than all of them, except for two." For a moment, I just sat there, processing, unsure of whether I had actually heard him right. Why? Why would he say that? What purpose did it serve? It was such an unnecessary comment, a careless string of words that lodged themselves in my mind, igniting a slow burn of hurt and confusion. It didn't matter if he hadn't meant it maliciously. It didn't matter if it was true in his eyes. It was the fact that he had thought about it at all, weighed me against them like I was part of some ranking system, and then said it out loud, as if I needed to know where I stood. I didn't even know how to react at first. I wanted to let it go, to tell myself it wasn't a big deal, but the words clung to me, stubborn and unshakable. My mood shifted. I went quiet not because I wanted to sulk, not because I was looking for attention, but because I needed a moment to process, to understand why it stung the way it did. And of course, he noticed. Not in the way I wished he would, not with any sense of realization or regret, but with impatience, with irritation, as if my silence was an inconvenience rather than a reaction. He fumbled for an explanation, something about not meaning it like that, about his wording being off, about how he actually meant that I could give them a run for their money. But it was already too late. The damage had been done. He could try to twist his words into something less sharp, but I had already felt the cut. Still, I said nothing. The energy in the room shifted. Where there had been easy conversation, there was now distance, an unspoken tension hanging between us. I could feel him getting annoyed, could sense his frustration growing with every second that I didn't brush it off, didn't laugh and move on. When the show ended, he went to the bedroom to work, and I went to take a shower, hoping the warm water would wash away the lingering discomfort, the quiet resentment that had taken root. Later, when I got into bed, he moved in to kiss me good night, but I hesitated. I was still upset, still waiting for him to acknowledge why his words had hurt, still waiting for an apology that I knew deep down wasn't coming. And sure enough, instead of taking responsibility, instead of offering any real remorse, he sighed, almost bored, and said, "Oh, I don't think I even said it like that, but if I did, I'm sorry." A half apology. A non-apology. A way to make it seem like he was doing the bare minimum while still leaving room for doubt, for the idea that I was just misremembering, just overreacting. And then, the final blow. "Do you want to apologize for the way you've been acting?" I stared at him, barely able to believe what I was hearing. Apologize? Apologize for what? For feeling hurt? For going quiet? For not bouncing back immediately after he said something thoughtless and unnecessary? He genuinely believed that I had ruined the night not with my words, not with any grand display of emotion, but simply by existing in a way that he found inconvenient. That was the moment something inside me cracked. I was so sick of this cycle, so exhausted by the expectation that I had to constantly manage not only my own emotions but his as well. That I had to be the one to swallow my hurt, to smooth things over, to make sure he never had to feel uncomfortable or deal with the consequences of his own words and actions. And the worst part? I knew how this would go. I knew that no matter how calmly I tried to explain, no matter how much I spelled it out for him, he would still find a way to turn it around on me. He would still see himself as the victim, still believe that I was the one ruining things, the one making everything harder. I had spent so many years trying to get him to understand, trying to make him see me, to recognize that my emotions were valid, that my reactions were normal, that I deserved to be treated with kindness. But he never did. And I was starting to wonder if he ever would. I laid there, stiff, the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating in the thick silence of the room. He had spoken them so easily, so casually, like a reflex, like he had been waiting to say them all along. Do you want to apologize for the way you've been acting? The arrogance of it, the sheer audacity to imply that I was the problem, that my silence, my natural response to being hurt, was somehow an offense that required an apology. I turned onto my side, my back facing him, trying to create some distance, some space where I could breathe without feeling the weight of his expectation pressing into me. He exhaled, annoyed, already shifting away, already making it clear that he had no patience for my feelings. I could feel his frustration radiating from him like heat, the stiffness in his posture, the barely concealed irritation in his breath. To him, I had made this into something. I had taken what should have been an easy night, a simple exchange, and turned it into another example of my supposed moping. And yet, wasn't it always like this? Hadn't it always been this way? He did something thoughtless, something careless, something that dug into me like a splinter under my skin, and when I didn't immediately brush it off, when I didn't laugh and pretend it was fine, I became the villain. It wasn't his words that had ruined the night. It wasn't his lack of consideration, his refusal to offer even the simplest of genuine apologies. No. It was my reaction. My unwillingness to bury my emotions for his comfort. My silence. I swallowed hard, pressing my fingertips against my forehead, trying to will the anger away, trying to convince myself that it wasn't worth another fight. But that was the thing about anger, it didn't just disappear because you wanted it to. It didn't dissolve just because ignoring it would make things easier. It simmered, it grew, it built itself into something impossible to ignore. For years, I had told myself that his behavior wasn't that bad. That he wasn't cruel, not really. That he wasn't abusive in the way that word is traditionally understood. He didn't yell. He didn't call me names. He didn't throw things or slam doors. Instead, he did something quieter, something more insidious, something that took years to fully recognize. He minimized me. He chipped away at me in the smallest ways, in moments that, by themselves, seemed insignificant but, when stitched together, formed an undeniable pattern. He made me feel small. He made me question myself. He made me feel wrong for being hurt, as though the only correct way to navigate this relationship was to never get upset, to never react in a way that inconvenienced him, to always prioritize his comfort over my own pain. And now, here we were again, trapped in the same exhausting cycle, the same tired script. He had hurt me, I had reacted, and somehow, I was the one at fault. I was the one ruining the night. I took a slow, measured breath, the kind that I had trained myself to take when trying to suppress my frustration, to keep the sharp edges of my thoughts from spilling over. Then, finally, I spoke, my voice quiet but firm. You always do this, I said. You always turn it around on me. He sighed loudly, like I was exhausting him. Oh my God, he muttered, rubbing his hands over his face. Here we go. The condescension in his tone ignited something in me, something I had been keeping buried for far too long. My fingers curled into the sheets, gripping the fabric as though it could anchor me, keep me from unraveling. You always do this, I repeated, my voice sharper now, cutting through the darkness of the room. You say something hurtful, and then, when I don't just laugh it off, I become the problem. You make fun of me when I'm upset, and when I react, you call it moping. You don't even try to understand how I feel. You don't even care that I'm hurt. You just want me to stop being quiet so you don't have to deal with it. He scoffed, shifting onto his back, staring at the ceiling like this conversation was beneath him. Because it's always something with you, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. You get upset over everything. It's exhausting. I felt that. I felt it like a slap. You get upset over everything. It wasn't just dismissal. It was rewriting history. It was painting me as unreasonable, as dramatic, as someone who chose to be hurt rather than someone who had been hurt. You're the one who said it, I shot back. You're the one who told me I was hotter than all of them except for two. Do you even realize how that sounds? How that feels? Why did you even say that? He groaned, rolling onto his side, away from me. I already explained it, he said, his voice laced with irritation. It didn't come out right. I meant it differently. Jesus, you're really gonna be mad about this. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. You still don't get it. I do get it, he snapped, sitting up now, glaring at me in the dim light of the room. You just always need something to be mad about. That's the real problem here. The words landed like a punch to the gut. You just always need something to be mad about. Like my emotions weren't real. Like my hurt wasn't real. Like I was choosing to feel this way, like it was some kind of game, something I did for attention or drama or control. I swallowed past the lump in my throat, blinking up at the ceiling, feeling something inside me begin to crack. It was different this time. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just frustration. It was something deeper, something colder. A realization creeping in like a slow, inevitable tide. He wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to wake up one day and suddenly understand how much his words hurt me, how much his constant dismissal chipped away at me, how much I needed to be heard, to be seen, to be treated like my emotions were just as valid as his own. Because he didn't want to. Because, to him, I was the problem. Not his words. Not his actions. Not the way he constantly minimized and mocked my feelings. Me. And maybe I had always known that. Maybe I had spent years trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself that if I just found the right way to explain it, if I just proved to him that I wasn't being irrational, he would finally understand. But he wouldn't. And if I stayed, if I kept doing this dance, if I kept twisting myself into knots trying to make him see me, then I was accepting that. I was accepting a life where my emotions would always be too much for him, where my silence would always be moping, where my hurt would always be a burden, a nuisance, an inconvenience. I turned onto my side, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. I didn't say anything else. I didn't have to. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to make him understand. For the first time, I was starting to understand it myself. The fight stretched into the night, tangled and relentless, looping in circles that led nowhere. My exhaustion was beyond physical, it was something deeper, something that made my bones feel heavy, like I had been carrying the weight of this battle for far too long. And in truth, I had. 9 years of this. 9 years of being told that my feelings were inconvenient, that my emotions needed to be packaged neatly, kept quiet, kept controlled, kept hidden so they wouldn't disturb him. His words still echoed in my mind, sharp and cruel, even though he had spoken them so casually, as if they meant nothing, as if they were just another passing remark in a long string of dismissals. If you had cancer or your cat died, I'd be scared to be around you. Like my grief, my pain, my suffering, if something truly devastating were to happen, wouldn't warrant comfort or kindness but would instead be something he had to endure. A burden on him. I couldn't even wrap my head around it. There was something almost chilling in the way he had framed it, in the way he had taken a hypothetical tragedy and made it about him. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. Because if he couldn't show me compassion now, if he couldn't hold space for even the smallest moments of sadness, frustration, or disappointment, then what made me think he ever would? What made me think that, if something truly terrible did happen, he would be capable of standing beside me? The truth had been staring me in the face for so long, but I had been too stubborn, too hopeful, too invested to see it. I had spent years trying to fix this, trying to make him understand, trying to force something out of him that simply wasn't there. He wasn't going to change. And even worse, he didn't want to. This wasn't just an issue of miscommunication. It wasn't about me finding the right words to finally make him understand. I had tried that. I had begged for kindness, for understanding, for the bare minimum of empathy. And every time, I had been met with the same thing: mockery, irritation, deflection. This was who he was. And I couldn't change that. And so, as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind started to unravel the future that I had once imagined with him. What would it look like? A lifetime of walking on eggshells, of swallowing my emotions to keep the peace, of knowing that if I ever truly needed him, really needed him, he would resent me for it. A life where my pain was met with eye rolls and sighs, where my struggles were a personal offense to him, where I would never be allowed to simply feel without it being turned into an attack. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. I turned to look at him then, really look at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't see someone I could make this work with. I didn't see a future here. I saw a person who would never be enough for me, a person who had never even tried to be. He was still on his side of the bed, scrolling through his phone like he hadn't just said something vile, like he hadn't just driven another wedge between us. Because to him, this wasn't a fight worth remembering. By tomorrow, he would act like nothing had happened, like I was the one who had overreacted, like it was my responsibility to make things normal again. But not this time. I sat up slowly, pressing my hands into the mattress, feeling my pulse steady in my chest. My voice, when I finally spoke, was eerily calm. I can't do this anymore. He barely glanced up. Oh, here we go. I ignored that. I was past the point of reacting to his dismissiveness. I'm serious. Something in my tone must have finally registered because he set his phone down and looked at me, frowning. What are you even talking about? I let out a slow breath. Us. His face twisted with irritation. Jesus Christ. Are you really going to be this dramatic? I almost laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was so predictable. Even now, even at this breaking point, he was still doing it. Still reducing me, still minimizing this, still pretending like I was the one blowing things out of proportion. I'm done, I said, and this time, the words tasted real. They tasted like freedom. I can't keep doing this. He scoffed, shaking his head. Oh, please. You're just upset. You always get like this when we fight. No, I met his eyes, letting him see the finality there. This isn't just a fight. This is everything. This is years of this. And I don't want to wake up 10 years from now and still be having this same conversation. I don't want to be with someone who thinks my feelings are a joke. I don't want to be with someone who thinks I'm ruining the mood just by being upset. I deserve more than that. He was silent for a beat, but I could see the shift in him. The way he was finally starting to understand that I wasn't bluffing. Still, he tried to backpedal. Come on, don't be like that. We just fight sometimes. Every couple does. Every couple fights, I agreed. But not like this. Not always like this. Not with one person constantly feeling like they have to beg for respect. Another silence stretched between us. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the calculations, the way he was weighing his options. Would he try to apologize now? Would he say just enough to keep me here? I saw the moment he realized he didn't want to. That he wouldn't. And that was it. That was my answer. I stood up, my hands steady as I reached for my phone, for the blanket at the edge of the bed. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew I wasn't staying in that bed, in that room, with him. Not tonight. He watched me, but he didn't stop me. And that told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't the kind of ending you see in movies, with screaming and shattered glass and dramatic declarations of love or hate. It was quiet. Just like I had always been. And in that quiet, I found my answer. I found the thing I had been looking for all along, not an apology, not validation, not even closure. I found the truth. I deserved better. And for the first time in 9 years, I was finally ready to walk away.